The hospital was unusually quiet for a Saturday night, and when the power outage hit, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of liberation. My shift was cut short, my hands clean of blood and paperwork for the first time in 12 hours. I left the fluorescent-lit corridors behind, stepping into the city air that smelled of rain and asphalt. Even exhaustion didn't weigh me down tonight. Not fully. I was going home to Caleb, and that should have been enough. Our apartment was silent as I slid the key into the lock. Darkness greeted me, warm and comforting. I placed my bag on the counter and listened to the faint hum of the refrigerator. For a moment, I allowed myself the luxury of imagining the scene I intended to create. A quiet surprise, maybe a glass of water waiting on the counter, or even just my smile when he realized I was home. But then I heard it. Laughter. Not casual laughter, not the clipped professionalism I was used to when he talked on the phone. This was easy, unburdened, intimate. I assumed it was Phoebe, his manager, or someone else connected to the chaos of his world. Caleb's schedule was as erratic as my own was structured. Late nights, early mornings, sudden trips. It was how we made it work. We had learned, or at least I had, to measure love in stolen moments, the brief seconds when he touched my arm in passing, or the rare shared coffee before a performance. But tonight, the laughter seemed too vivid, too present. My heart, despite the fatigue, picked up speed. I approached the studio door quietly. Caleb's studio was at the end of the hall, a sanctuary of cables, microphones, and scribbled lyrics pinned to corkboards. I tapped lightly, intending to announce my presence and perhaps watch him for a few minutes before retreating with the quiet knowledge of his company. But as my knuckles brushed the door, a whisper carried through the thin crack. It was Caleb, speaking softly. Not to me. To someone else. That subtle, secretive tone, warm and unguarded, pierced something deep inside me. My pulse quickened, but not entirely from anger. It was disbelief, confusion, the stark awareness that the intimacy I longed for in my relationship existed elsewhere. I didn't move closer. I didn't knock. I simply leaned against the wall, letting the words slide under the door, as though the gap itself had become a revelation I wasn't ready to fully see. The rest of the night blurred. I stayed awake in the bedroom, pretending to sleep while he came out of the studio hours later, tired and content, his lips brushing my forehead in what I had once mistaken for affection. I watched him settle into the quiet rhythm of our shared space, noting the difference between proximity and presence. I let him sleep, though the weight of what I had heard pressed against my chest, refusing to release me. That night, exhaustion wasn't physical. It wasn't the end of a long shift or the hours spent upright in the hospital corridors. It was the recognition of a distance that had always existed between us, now laid bare in laughter, whispered secrets, and an intimacy that I could not share. It was the first time I realized that love could be present in your life and absent at the same time. That even living together didn't guarantee anything but shared walls. I didn't speak, didn't confront. I simply observed, quiet, weary, and aware that the life we had built was held together only by the delicate, uneven threads of our mutual compromise, and that some threads had already frayed beyond repair. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the half-closed blinds, casting narrow strips of light across the bedroom floor. I lay there for a long time, listening to Caleb breathe beside me, slow and even, and I felt a strange, hollow weight in my chest. The apartment was quiet, the hum of city life muted behind the walls, and yet I felt the loud echo of the night before reverberating through me. I had told myself I wouldn't think about it. I had convinced myself that it was a misunderstanding, or perhaps just misinterpreted moments that seemed clearer under the lens of sleep deprivation and exhaustion. But every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it. Caleb's laughter. That unguarded tone, the playful whispers, the intimacy in his words that wasn't mine to share. The way he sounded relaxed, happy, alive in a way he never was with me. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a revelation. The life I thought I shared with him existed only in fragments. We were living parallel lives, orbiting the same apartment, brushing against each other in fleeting moments. My career demanded precision, endurance, and attention. I carried it with pride, even when it exhausted me. Caleb's world was different, chaotic, creative, unpredictable, and I had thought that our love could bridge the chasm between these universes. But the laughter, the words I overheard, exposed a distance I had been blind to. I moved to the kitchen, pouring a cup of coffee I didn't taste. I stared out at the city waking up, the streetlights fading into morning glare. I thought about Phoebe. Her voice was never harsh, never taunting, but it existed in my mind as a quiet, insistent marker. Someone else occupies the space you thought was yours. Caleb's happiness, the effortless way he interacted with her, it was intoxicating, and it was not mine. That was the part that hurt the most. The realization that the man I loved could exist fully, completely, and joyfully without me. I replayed the night in fragments, each more painful than the last. The small whispered jokes, the soft teasing, the laughter that filled the studio like sunlight streaming through open windows. I imagined him leaning close to Phoebe, his expression open, relaxed, alive in a way he rarely allowed around me. It wasn't the physicality that cut me. It was the emotional space he had gifted to someone else, the transparency I had never experienced. By mid-morning, I had dressed and stepped into the city. I walked aimlessly, letting the sun warm my face, letting the distant noise of traffic and voices occupy my thoughts. The more I thought about it, the more I understood the truth I had been avoiding. Our relationship was fragile because I had been holding it together alone. I carried the weight of compromise, of patience, of understanding. He carried something else entirely, and I had been blind to it. Returning home later, I felt the apartment differently. It was no longer a sanctuary, but a quiet, suspended theater of realities I wasn't allowed to witness. I avoided the studio, passed by it with careful steps, and for the first time, acknowledged the truth I had resisted. I couldn't continue like this. I couldn't thrive alongside him when he was thriving elsewhere. When Caleb eventually emerged from the studio, he looked at me as though nothing had changed, the same gentle affection in his tired eyes. He kissed my forehead, soft and familiar, as if to anchor me to the morning. I let him, though a part of me recoiled from the ease with which he performed normalcy. I had no words, only observation. I saw the divide in his expression, the warmth directed at me and the shadow of another presence lingering in his voice. I saw it, and I recognized it, and I felt the exhaustion of fighting a battle he hadn't even known existed. Asked the question I had held in my chest all night, not loud, not dramatic. My voice was calm, precise, as if delivering a report. Who is the S you're taking on a rehearsal for retirement? Caleb's expression faltered. The softness he had shown in the night's whispered affection couldn't mask the truth. He hesitated, the words caught somewhere between explanation and evasion. And in that moment, I let myself feel everything I had been holding in check. The heartbreak, the betrayal, the crushing realization that the intimacy I longed for existed elsewhere. It wasn't about shouting. It wasn't about confrontation. It was about understanding. About recognizing that what I had believed to be a partnership was fractured, perhaps irreparably. And it was in that quiet acknowledgement, sitting across from him in the morning light, that I first allowed myself to grieve, not just for him, not just for us, but for the version of love I had imagined and had never truly had. The apartment felt colder that evening, though the heater hummed steadily in the corner. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window, watching the streetlights blur into the wet pavement. Outside, the world carried on in its usual rhythm, people rushing to appointments, cars slicing through the night, street vendors packing up for the day, but inside, my world had shifted irreversibly. The laughter I overheard, Caleb's warmth shared with someone else, had left a residue in the air that no amount of cleaning could erase. I tried to focus on work, my laptop, emails, patient charts, but each ping of a message, each alert, pulled me back to him. Not because I wanted to read messages he wasn't sending to me, but because I was trying to decode everything I thought I knew. Our lives had been a series of fractured signals, overlapping schedules, missed conversations, and stolen mornings. I had justified it as the price we paid for our respective careers, but now I saw it for what it truly was, an excuse to avoid the hard questions. I remembered the countless nights I had come home after shifts longer than I cared to count, hoping for a moment with him. Sometimes he'd be at the studio, headphones on, eyes glued to the screen. I had stood quietly, letting the music fill the room, willing myself to feel connected through proximity. I had told myself that love sometimes required patience, endurance, even absence. But the sound of his laughter last night, unguarded and free, illuminated the truth. He had been present in another world all along, a world I wasn't invited to enter. Sleep was elusive. I lay awake, counting the minutes, as if they might offer insight. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice. I heard the laughter, the whispered words, the playful intimacy directed at someone else. It was a sound that belonged to another space, another understanding of him, a version of Caleb I would never know. And yet, I had clung to fragments of it, as if any contact with his world, however diluted, could be sufficient. By morning, I knew something had to change. I couldn't continue operating on the hope of partial attention, of affection doled out in fragments. Love was supposed to be a shared signal, a channel that carried trust and presence in equal measure. What I had experienced was interference. Static. Messages lost in translation. I started the day mechanically, making coffee, dressing, checking my schedule. But even the familiar routines felt hollow. Every glance at the clock reminded me of how long he had been absent emotionally, how often I had adjusted my life to accommodate a man who existed fully only on his own terms. Every quiet moment of the day pressed me to consider the reality I had ignored. Our relationship was no longer mutual. I didn't confront him immediately. There was no dramatic showdown, no sharp words hurled across the apartment. Instead, I observed. I noticed the little things that had always seemed inconsequential, but now took on new meaning. The way he lingered over his phone. The way he smiled while reading messages I would never see. The way our conversations had shifted from shared laughter to truncated exchanges. The cracks were everywhere, but I had been blind to them. And in that observation, I found clarity. It wasn't about rage. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about recognition. I could continue to shrink myself to fit into a relationship that was, in effect, a solo performance with an absent partner. Or I could reclaim my space, my time, and my energy. I made small, deliberate decisions throughout the day, closing my laptop early, taking a longer walk than usual, resisting the impulse to call him, to ask, to seek reassurance. Each act was a small rehearsal for independence, a way to practice the kind of life I might lead without him at the center. By evening, I realized that grief was not linear. It was not a wave to ride or a cliff to fall from. It was a network of subtle, persistent shifts. And within those shifts, I began to see the possibility of movement. Forward, away from the fractured signals, toward clarity, toward something that was entirely my own. That night, I slept in a quiet apartment, untouched by laughter that wasn't mine, and woke with a single thought echoing through me. Presence is a language, and it is a language I intend to speak fluently from now on. The next morning, sunlight filtered softly through the blinds, but I didn't linger in bed. I moved through the apartment with quiet purpose, rearranging small things, reorganizing drawers, reclaiming corners of space that had silently belonged to him more than to me. It was subtle work, nothing dramatic, tweaking the placement of my books, shifting the chairs just so, placing a plant in the window to catch the light. Every adjustment felt like a declaration, though one whispered only to myself, "This is mine." I made coffee and carried it to the living room, setting it on the table beside a notebook I hadn't touched in months. My pen hovered over the page, then began to move of its own accord. I wrote not about him, not about betrayal, but about me, my routines, my ambitions, the quiet spaces I had been neglecting while navigating a life tethered to someone else's whims. Words poured out, slow at first, then faster, almost urgent, until the page was filled with sentences that reminded me who I was outside of him. It was astonishing how much had been waiting there all along, hidden under years of compromise. I had allowed myself to bend, to accommodate, to smooth over every conflict so that the relationship appeared harmonious. I had overlooked the little betrayals, the quiet absences, the laughter that belonged elsewhere. And yet now, in the act of writing, of organizing, of claiming this small apartment, I recognized a freedom I hadn't fully experienced before. The apartment felt different by the afternoon. There was a lightness in the air, a sense of potential that hadn't existed when Caleb's presence dominated every corner. I took out my phone, scrolling past his messages without responding, noticing for the first time that silence could be more restorative than connection. I didn't call him, didn't check in. Instead, I called a friend I hadn't spoken to in months, arranging a long lunch where conversation wouldn't be punctuated by absences or half-hearted reassurances. Even as I worked through these small acts of reclamation, my mind drifted occasionally to the cafe, to the man whose quiet presence had felt so steady the week before. It wasn't longing, not exactly. It was a gentle curiosity, a recognition that human connection could exist without chaos, without intrusion, without pain. The thought didn't dominate me. It was a soft note in a composition I was learning to play again, slowly, deliberately, with attention to every rhythm and pause. By evening, I found myself tidying the kitchen, stacking dishes, wiping counters, rearranging spices so that they felt both practical and aesthetically pleasing. Each action, repetitive and intentional, carried a sense of ceremony. It wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about claiming control over my own life, about proving to myself that I could exist fully, without dependence on someone else's presence or validation. When Caleb came home hours later, I wasn't waiting by the door. I wasn't bracing for confrontation. I had spent the day inhabiting my space fully, and he arrived to an apartment that no longer reflected compromise. He carried his fatigue, the remnants of his late-night sessions, the familiar tension of a man used to exerting himself elsewhere. But I was present, grounded, unshakable. He kissed my cheek, soft and tentative, expecting the same compliance I had always offered. But I had nothing to give him that night. No questions, no accusations, no gestures of reassurance. I simply smiled faintly, acknowledging him, but not surrendering myself. He felt it immediately. I could see it in the way his expression faltered, uncertain, as if the ground beneath him had shifted slightly. And in that falter, I realized something profound. Reclaiming your life doesn't require shouting or drama. It requires calm presence, steadfast boundaries, and an unwavering recognition of your own worth. Later, as I stood by the window again, looking out over the city lights, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle in my chest. It wasn't the intoxicating rush of revenge or the sting of betrayal. It was the clarity that comes with self-possession. For the first time in months, I felt anchored not to someone else's whims, but to my own choices, my own routines, my own sense of identity. And I understood, fully, that the hardest part of love isn't betrayal. It's realizing that survival, peace, and presence within yourself are far more powerful than any shared laughter, any whispered secret, any fragile, fractured intimacy ever could be. The first days of reclaiming my apartment had been quiet, almost ceremonious. Each morning, I moved through my routines with the deliberate attention of someone learning a new language, speaking words that had been silenced for too long. Coffee, journal, sunrise, small tasks, simple things, yet each one carried weight. They were my anchors, reminders that I existed independently of anyone else's presence or validation. By the fifth day, the stillness had transformed from tentative calm to a tangible sense of freedom. I could hear myself think without interruption. I could organize my space without feeling that invisible pressure to accommodate another life. The apartment, once shared and crowded with expectations, now reflected my rhythm. The music I played in the mornings, the books I left open on tables, the scattered notes of sketches for projects I'd long neglected, they were all for me. All mine. I realized, almost with surprise, that my sense of loneliness had begun to dissipate. Not because someone else had filled it, but because I had stopped trying to fill it with fragments of someone else. Caleb's laughter no longer haunted me. The memory existed like an old photograph, acknowledged, but distant. In its place, I felt a quiet curiosity about what life could hold for me. Not revenge, not longing, not even hope for him, just possibility. One evening, I decided to walk to the cafe I had avoided in the past weeks. I hadn't seen the man from before, but the thought of the space itself, small, warm, filled with quiet energy, felt like a safe environment to inhabit. I chose a corner seat, deliberately distant from any familiar faces, and let my eyes drift over the room. The low hum of conversation and the soft clinking of cups was comforting. It reminded me that life, ordinary and unremarkable in its rhythms, continued regardless of personal heartbreak. I didn't notice him at first. He entered quietly, carrying the same notebook I remembered, sitting at his usual table. Our eyes met for a brief instant, a recognition neither urgent nor desperate. It was subtle, an acknowledgement without expectation. I didn't move. I didn't approach. But the sight of him, calm and unobtrusive, reminded me that human connection could exist without chaos or intrusion. That it was possible to inhabit a space where intimacy was measured, consensual, and safe. I spent the rest of the evening writing in my journal, sketching ideas for projects I had abandoned, cataloging the thoughts that had been buried under months of compromise and exhaustion. Every word, every line, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I noticed that my breathing had slowed, that my shoulders were less tight, that the small, tense knot at the back of my neck had eased. The clarity wasn't immediate or dramatic. It was subtle, cumulative, a quiet restoration of self. When I left the cafe, the man from before had already disappeared, leaving only the memory of a presence that was steady, respectful, and unobtrusive. I didn't dwell on him. I didn't imagine possibilities. I simply walked home in the cool evening air, appreciating the fact that the world was moving forward, and I was moving with it. Back in my apartment, I paused before entering, letting the silence settle around me. I poured a glass of wine and leaned against the counter, watching the city lights glitter in the distance. I realized that life after betrayal was not about rushing into new relationships or filling empty spaces. It was about inhabiting your own world fully, without compromise, and letting the rhythm of your choices dictate your sense of safety and contentment. And yet, somewhere in the quiet, I sensed the faintest possibility of connection, a spark not of need, but of curiosity. It wasn't love. It wasn't even longing. It was the quiet awareness that someone, somewhere, could enter my life without disrupting the careful balance I had established. That intimacy could be offered and received gently, without pain or betrayal, if and when I was ready. That night, as I slid into bed and let the familiar comfort of my sheets enfold me, I felt something I hadn't in months, a steady pulse of confidence. My life was no longer defined by absence, by betrayal, or by fractured signals. It was defined by me. And for the first time in a long time, that definition felt enough. The days blurred together in a way that felt almost intentional. Each morning, I woke earlier than I had in months, not out of obligation but out of desire. The sunlight slanted through the blinds differently now, warmer somehow, like it recognized the subtle reclamation of my life. I brewed coffee, poured it carefully into my favorite mug, and lingered by the window, savoring the quiet hum of the city waking. It was ordinary, routine, and yet it carried a richness I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. I started small, returning to the little practices I had once loved but abandoned. Sketching in my notebook, organizing the apartment with deliberate attention, and preparing meals that nourished both body and mind. I realized that in those months with Caleb, I had lived reactively, adjusting every decision to accommodate him, his unpredictable hours, his whims, his silences. Now I moved deliberately, intentionally. The apartment, the streets I walked, the cafe I frequented, all of it became a reflection of me, not an extension of someone else. One evening, I went back to the small cafe I had discovered earlier. I claimed my usual corner, the quiet one tucked away near the window. I pulled out my journal, but for once, I didn't write about betrayal or exhaustion. I wrote about rhythms, my routines, my small victories. I noted the way the steam rose from my cup, the soft chatter of strangers, and the distant hum of the city outside. It was an unremarkable night by anyone else's standards, but to me, it was significant. It was proof that I could exist in the world fully, without compromise, without leaning on anyone for validation. As I sketched absent-mindedly, I noticed him again, the man from before. He sat a few tables away, quietly observing, not intruding. There was no urgency in his gaze, no expectation of connection, just awareness. And in that simple observation, I felt something I hadn't anticipated, a flicker of warmth, a subtle curiosity. Not desire, not longing, just recognition. Someone could exist in my space without overwhelming it, without dismantling the careful balance I had created. I stayed late at the cafe, letting the night fold around me, feeling a quiet pulse of life outside my apartment walls. When I finally walked home, the streets were nearly empty and the city lights reflected on wet asphalt. I realized how much space I had carved for myself, how much freedom existed in solitude, and how much strength I had quietly accumulated in the absence of trust. The night air carried clarity. I didn't need to fill my life with someone else to feel complete. I simply needed to honor the space I had reclaimed. Back in the apartment, I began reorganizing things I had ignored for months. My bookshelves, my art supplies, the closet overflowing with clothes I rarely wore. Each item I touched became a small act of assertion, an affirmation of the life I intended to build. I realized that reclaiming my space wasn't just physical. It was emotional, spiritual, a recalibration of my own boundaries. I was not defined by his choices, his laughter, or the intimacy he had shared elsewhere. I was defined by what I could cultivate for myself, quietly, deliberately, intentionally. And yet, even as I thrived in solitude, I felt a subtle undercurrent of possibility. The man from the cafe had not intruded on my life. He had simply existed nearby, a gentle reminder that connection could be measured, respectful, and non-disruptive. I allowed myself to imagine moments where companionship could be gentle, optional, reciprocal. And I recognized that this flicker of curiosity was different from dependence. It was a reminder that love, or at least closeness, did not have to be destructive. It could exist harmoniously with the self I was learning to reclaim. That night, as I slid into bed, I felt a calm pulse of satisfaction. The apartment, the streets, the quiet corners of my life, all reflected my choices, my rhythms, my authority over myself. Betrayal and fractured signals still existed in memory, but they no longer dictated my days. They were lessons, reminders of what I would never compromise again. I closed my eyes, letting the exhaustion of the week settle into a quiet contentment. I was rebuilding, slowly, deliberately, and on my own terms. And somewhere in the quiet, I acknowledged that when the time came, I would allow connection to enter my life, but only if it honored the rhythms I had spent so long reclaiming. The city had a different rhythm at dusk, a slow, deliberate pulse that seemed to mirror my own. The streets glimmered under the amber glow of the streetlights, and the faint hum of distant traffic filled the spaces between buildings with a quiet, comforting energy. I walked deliberately, letting each step remind me that I was moving forward, physically and emotionally. Every block I passed was a silent testament to the boundaries I had begun to enforce and the space I had courageously reclaimed. I had spent weeks immersing myself in my own rhythms, rebuilding my life piece by piece, and yet I could feel a subtle shift within me. It was a sense of readiness, a flicker of curiosity that wasn't desperation, longing, or fear. It was the recognition that I could exist fully on my own, but also allow the possibility of another presence, a kind of closeness that respected the life I had fought to reclaim. That evening, I returned to the cafe that had become my sanctuary, the place where my thoughts could settle into clarity, where I could observe life without interruption. He was there again, the man who had quietly captured my attention without expectation, occupying the same corner with his notebook, calm and unobtrusive. Our eyes met for a brief, silent acknowledgement, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of ease. He smiled, subtle and warm, and I recognized it as a gesture of respect, a recognition of my presence, without intrusion. I sat at my usual corner table, pulled out my journal, and allowed my pen to move freely. I wrote about my day, my reclaimed rhythms, the subtle triumphs in ordinary acts of autonomy. And then, without thinking too deeply, I allowed my mind to imagine scenarios where connection could exist without compromise. Not the fraught intimacy of the past, not the fractured signals of betrayal, but a gentle companionship where curiosity and respect coexisted with independence. When he approached, it was tentative, cautious. There was no pretense, no expectation, only the quiet acknowledgement that we were both present in the same space. "Mind if I sit?" he asked softly. His voice was low, respectful, carrying a warmth that was unfamiliar yet inviting. I nodded, surprised at the calmness I felt. I didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess, because I had spent enough time navigating fractured signals and betrayal to know that this moment was different. We spoke quietly, deliberately. Not about the past, not about others, not about expectations. We discussed the city, art, music, and fleeting observations about life. Our conversation flowed easily, without intrusion or urgency, and I realized with clarity how much I had missed the simple joy of unguarded dialogue. I felt my chest relax, my shoulders lower, and my mind quiet. The heaviness of the past weeks, the betrayal, the fractured relationship, the nights of overheard laughter, began to dissolve, replaced by a cautious optimism that perhaps intimacy could exist without cost to self. As the evening stretched, I recognized that I was crossing a threshold. Not into romance, not fully yet, but into a space where connection could be voluntary, respectful, and mutually enriching. I no longer felt the need to anticipate pain or betrayal. I no longer needed to armor myself against imagined intrusions or fractured signals. In that cafe, in the presence of someone who existed without demanding, I discovered the joy of choice, the power to allow closeness without surrendering my autonomy. By the time I walked home, the night was fully settled, the streets nearly empty, the city lights reflecting softly on the pavement. I felt a quiet pulse of satisfaction. I had crossed an invisible line, from reaction to action, from survival to agency, from mourning to cautious hope. My steps were deliberate, my mind alert, my heart open without being vulnerable in the wrong way. At the apartment, I paused by the window, watching the distant lights, the faint flicker of life beyond my walls. I felt a profound sense of accomplishment, not from a grand gesture or a confrontation, but from the quiet assertion of my own boundaries, the reclamation of my own space, and the recognition that I could allow connection, careful, considered, and mutually respectful, into my life once again. That night, as I slid into bed, I felt a gentle pulse of possibility. I was no longer defined by betrayal, absence, or fractured intimacy. I was defined by clarity, choice, and the quiet courage to cross thresholds on my own terms. And somewhere in that clarity, I allowed myself to imagine that when the right moment came, intimacy could exist in harmony with the life I had fought to reclaim. The morning light filtered softly through the blinds, warming the apartment in a way that felt like a quiet affirmation. I stretched, feeling the familiar ache of muscles worked and rested in rhythm, and realized that for the first time in months, I was awake without tension coiling in my chest. The apartment smelled faintly of fresh coffee and paper, a scent that belonged entirely to me. The past weeks had been a careful reclamation of my life. I had reorganized the physical spaces I inhabited, reconstructed the routines I had abandoned, and reestablished the boundaries I had allowed to blur. I had practiced solitude, not as punishment, but as nourishment. I had learned the quiet art of existing fully in my own world, of valuing presence over longing, clarity over chaos. And now, standing in the middle of my apartment, I felt a sense of completion, a horizon I could finally see, stretching out with possibilities that didn't require compromise or compromise of self. The lingering shadow of Caleb's betrayal no longer dictated my heartbeat. I remembered the overheard laughter, the intimacy not meant for me, and the weight of nights spent half present in a fractured relationship. But those memories were no longer anchors. They were lessons, etched clearly in the margins of my mind, guiding me rather than binding me. I brewed coffee, carrying the mug to the window. Outside, the city stretched wide and indifferent, bustling with lives that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with me. I let my gaze wander, taking in the patterns of light and shadow, the rhythm of movement, the quiet pulse of life beyond my walls. It was a horizon I had ignored for too long, obscured by the fog of compromise, confusion, and quiet betrayal. Today, it was mine to see clearly. The man from the cafe had become a quiet presence in my peripheral vision. Not intrusive, not demanding, but a gentle reminder that connection could exist without danger to my reclaimed space. He had not asked for my time, nor intruded on my boundaries. He had simply existed, observing, present yet unobtrusive. And in that existence, I discovered something profound. Companionship could be safe. Affection could be measured. Interest could be gentle. I had spent so long navigating fractured signals that I had forgotten what it felt like for intimacy to arrive without fracture. By mid-morning, I returned to my journal. This time, I didn't write about betrayal, not about fear, not even about hope in the conventional sense. I wrote about agency, about boundaries, about the quiet empowerment that comes from reclaiming the narrative of one's life. I sketched lines of potential projects, notes on art, on exploration, on work. Everything that had once felt secondary, diluted by compromise and compromise of self, now felt primary. I was the center, the axis, the point from which all decisions radiated. Later, as I walked through the city streets, I felt a clarity I hadn't known in years. Each step was deliberate, unhurried, measured with intention. I noticed the sunlight on a stone facade, the curve of a tree branch against the sky, the sound of distant music. I recognized the freedom in observation, the joy in simply noticing without expectation, without longing, without intrusion. It was a reclamation of senses as well as space. When I returned to the apartment that evening, he was there, quietly seated in the corner of the cafe's mental shadow that had followed me into life, an imagined presence, perhaps, but no less comforting. Our eyes met, and there was recognition without demand. No apologies, no explanations, no tension. Just acknowledgement of two people who could occupy the same world without diminishing one another. I allowed myself to smile faintly, a small gesture of trust and openness. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't dependency. It was a statement. I am present. I am whole. And if connection comes, it must honor the life I have reclaimed. That night, as I slid between the sheets, I felt the pulse of possibility hum gently beneath my skin. Betrayal had taught me vigilance. Fractured signals had taught me clarity. And solitude had taught me power, the power of existing fully in my own world. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply, and for the first time in months, I felt a horizon stretching before me that was entirely my own. A horizon that could include love, connection, and shared laughter, but only if it respected the boundaries I had fought so hard to establish. And in that clarity, that ownership, I finally understood. I had survived betrayal. I had rebuilt myself. I had reclaimed my horizon. I was whole. I was free. And I was ready for whatever came next.